Accents, dialects, descriptivism, prescriptivism, etymology, cognates, syntax, morphology, semantics, pragmatics, phonology, phonetics, phonetic inventory, phonemes, allophones, morphemes, syllables, words, phrases, and sentences. Have you ever heard some of these terms when people talk about language and linguistics and wondered, what do they really mean? Hi, my name is Carson. This is Professor Woody and Mr. Ford, a channel where we cover all kinds of things related to linguistics. And in this video, I am going to explain some of those basic terms that are constantly used in linguistics and that we have used and will continue to use and are important for understanding some of our videos. Let's start with perhaps the biggest one. What is linguistics in general? Well, you can think of it as the science of language. How does language actually work? How do we perceive it and how do we use it? It's not just speaking and being interested in learning languages. Polyglots aren't necessarily linguists. They're just people who learn a lot of languages. Linguistics is how they actually function, how they're related, how they change. There are so many different branches of linguistics that all have their different specialties and overlaps. And it's important to note that linguistics, and especially research as well as all science, is descriptive, not prescriptive. So descriptive means that we describe how things are. We don't prescribe or tell people how things should be. So in linguistics, we are simply listening to how people speak and use language and describing how that happens. We are not telling people that they should speak this way or that way. We are not telling people that you should pronounce things a certain way. We are describing how they do pronounce them. So let's go into some of those major branches of linguistics. At least the way they were taught to me is that there are five major disciplines: morphology, semantics, syntax, phonology, and phonetics. Morphology is looking at words and how they are constructed. So you have your word roots, and then you have things like prefixes, suffixes, compound words, all those different ways in which we construct a word and give it meaning. Semantics is looking more at the meanings themselves. So, for example, if I have a group of children from 5th, 6th, and 7th grade, and I say, gather all the elementary schoolers over there and all the middle schoolers over there, how would you divide that group? What does that word elementary schoolers and what does middle schoolers actually mean? Well, elementary schoolers refers to 5th graders, and middle schoolers refers to 6th and 7th grade. Obviously, middle school includes 8th grade as well, at least normally in the United States, that's how it works. But when you use that term in the context of knowing that you're surrounded by 5th, 6th, and 7th graders, you're referring specifically to the 6th and 7th graders and not to the 5th graders. Where if you said all the school children, it refers to each and every group. But you could also say, get me the 6th graders. They are middle schoolers, but not all middle schoolers are necessarily 6th graders. It's that same thing about how some fingers are thumbs, but not all thumbs are finger. Wait, sorry, I did that backwards. All thumbs are fingers, but not all fingers are thumbs. Or all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. Set theory is a huge part of this. Then we have pragmatics, which might also sometimes be grouped in with semantics because it is similar. It does have to do with meanings, but pragmatics has a bit more to do with the context surrounding the meaning. So to give you an overly obvious example, if I were at a university and said I want all the linguists to meet in that room this afternoon, am I talking about all the linguists in the world? Well, no. Given the context of the situation, maybe I'm at some kind of university convention, I'm talking about the linguists that are part of that organization or part of that event. Syntax is about the sentence structure. So this is where you start building phrases and whole sentences. So things like word order, subject, object, verb, object. Those are syntax. But also things like, do your adjectives come before or after the noun in your language? How many adjectives can you use in a single phrase? What order do those adjectives come in? What about adverbs? What about prepositions or postpositions? If I said a phrase like green eggs and ham, am I talking about green eggs and green ham? Or am I just talking about green eggs and then normal ham? That depends on the sentence structure, which is the syntax. Phonetics and phonology often kind of go together because they both have to do with the sounds. But to be more specific, phonetics is how we produce and perceive certain sounds like b, d, g, ka. How do we actually produce that with our mouth physically? And how do we hear it and perceive it with our brains? And then phonology is some of the more abstract things like the intonation, maybe syllables or tones or stress and things like that. Because they both deal with the sounds and in many ways often overlap with each other and depend on each other, you might often hear people, myself included, say, I'm going to talk about phonetics, and then end up talking about stuff that does in fact include phonology. But understand that technically, if you look at the specific fields, phonology is more specific than just phonetics. Speaking about sounds, what is the real difference between accent and dialect, at least when we're talking about linguistics? Well, an accent is quite simply your phonetics and phonology. How do you pronounce things? What sounds do you use, and in what context do you use them? Now, what about dialect? Well, dialect includes your accent, but as well as other things like maybe different vocabulary that you use, your slang, jargon, and stuff like that, or the word order and other sentence structure and syntax differences that you might have, as well as semantic differences. So, accent is specifically the sounds you make and how you make them, and a dialect is everything about how you speak, including the sounds. An accent is a subset of dialects, just like squares and rectangles. You will often hear people use dialect kind of interchangeably to mean accent because dialect does include accent. So, if I said in a North American dialect they pronounce things this way, but in a European dialect they pronounce things that way, it still makes sense. We're still talking about the sounds because that is part of the dialect, just not switching back and forth between using the terms accent to be more specific. Etymology is a specific field of linguistics that looks at the history and evolutions of words. You can trace words back to their origin, similar to how you trace biological species back to their origin. This includes the phonetics, how the pronunciation of a word has changed over time, as well as the semantics, how the meaning of a word has changed over time. This brings us to another word, cognates. What exactly does that mean? A lot of people, maybe even your own language teachers, have used that to describe words in two different languages that might look and sound similar and mean the same thing, and therefore use false cognates to mean words that look and sound similar but mean something else. Perhaps the most famous example of a false cognate between English and Spanish is English embarrassed and Spanish embarazada, which doesn't actually mean embarrassed, it means pregnant. But it's actually a real cognate because in the field of linguistics and etymology, cognate describes words that come from a common origin. Embarrassed and embarazada both evolved from the same older word. Basically, it meant something kind of like burdened, but in English, that took on the meaning of being burdened by the embarrassment of the situation, and in Spanish, it meant being burdened by carrying a child. In many cases, cognates look, sound, and even mean the same or similar things across many languages. For example, most Indo European languages still use words very similar to father or pater or padre to mean, well, father. In other cases, they might look or sound similar but mean very different things, like in the case of embarrassed and embarazada. But in other cases, a cognate might sound and look very different today, but still have a similar meaning. And in other cases, they might just be completely different in all of those aspects. Now, a true false cognate in terms of linguistics would be words that look, sound, and mean similar things, but are just coincidentally that similar. They have no etymological relation. A famous example is the Australian indigenous language Mbabaram, which had a word dog, and it meant the same thing as English dog. Two languages that were very distinct, completely unrelated, and isolated from each other for thousands of years came into contact and realized we both share pretty much the exact same word for dog. Pure coincidence. A phoneme is a basic sound, and your phonetic inventory, or a language's specific phonetic inventory, is the group of sounds that are within that language. For example, English is often said to have 44 individual phonemes. Now, obviously, this depends greatly on your specific way of speech. Everybody's accent is different, everybody has different phonemes and different numbers of phonemes. So, with such a widely spoken language like English, we should probably look at it more of a range, like the typical English speaking accent has something like between 40 and 50 different phonemes. And languages can have a lot more or a lot less phonemes. For example, Hawaiian only has about 13 to 15 phonemes. Now, an allophone is a variation of a phoneme that shows up in predictable contexts for certain dialects. For example, many people will replace a voiceless alveolar plosive, aka the T sound ta, with an allophone of a glottal stop or an alveolar tap. Take the word butter. Some English accents might replace the T and pronounce it as ba'a. In my North American accent, I pronounce it with butter, with that tap instead of a strong ta. But if a foreigner learning English were to ask me how do I pronounce that word slowly, I would revert to the ta and say butter. I wouldn't say butter. That's because the underlying phoneme is still a ta, even if its allophonic representation on the surface level ends up being a ara. And again, that's in a specific predictable context. So in my case, it would be a vowel, then a T, or really any kind of alveolar plosive because I do it with Ds as well, and then another vowel and an R. For example, butter, but also rudder, as well as batter and batter, which sound the same. And I don't replace all my D's and T's with that sound. For example, at the beginnings and ends of words, to and do, or walked and ruined. Now let's finish with some basic word and sentence building terms. What is a morpheme? A morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning, which could be a single syllable with a single phoneme, or it could be a syllable with multiple phonemes, or it could be multiple syllables. But it generally cannot stand on its own, so it needs to be attached. It's either a root of a word that needs something else attached to it, or it could be an affix like a prefix or suffix. For example, the word root gen would not stand on its own. Traditionally, you'd need to attach other things to it, like generate, genus, generation. Although now it is being used on its own, basically as a shortened form of generation, although that's with the context that you do have that extra full word attached to it, generation. Or the prefix re to do something again. It's a prefix. It can't stand on its own. It's not its own word. You need to attach it to another word. Recreate, reread, rewatch, etc. And then a word is the smallest unit of meaning that can stand on its own, which again could be a single syllable and single phoneme and therefore also a single morpheme, but it could also be comprised of multiple morphemes. For example, the indefinite article a single phoneme, a single morpheme, and a single word. And then you have a lot of function words, especially with like prepositions, articles, determiners, the, in, of, which can stand on their own with just a single morpheme and sometimes just a single phoneme. Now, when you put multiple words together, that's how you build a phrase. And then multiple phrases together and you build a sentence. But of course, a sentence could also just be a single phrase or even just a single word, especially if you're quickly responding to a question. You might just do that with one word. Did you go to the movies yesterday? Yes. No. Either answer is a single morpheme, a single syllable, a single word, a single phrase, and a single sentence all at the same time, which is totally grammatically acceptable. But then, of course, everything I've just said now is also a single sentence, which is filled with a bunch of different phrases. And that is how you go from a sound to a morpheme to a syllable to a word to a phrase and a sentence, and that is how we speak. And those are some of the basic terms that we use in linguistics that you will hear in a lot of our videos. If you have any more questions, please feel free to leave a comment, like, share, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching and hope to see you in the next one.